No gimmick intro for this one, we're just getting straight into it. I promise you all I'll do a fun intro next time. This video is going to be on a slightly different topic to one that I would normally be taken in by, but I really like football. Although, admittedly, a lot of my interaction with football is in the form of Football Manager, which is just an amazing time sink and a great way to live out my dreams of taking my hometown to the very top of the Premier League. You'll probably have seen the news. It was kind of hard to miss. 12 football clubs had declared that they were going to be forming a breakaway league called the European Super League, intended to replace the UEFA Champions League while still participating in their domestic leagues. Unsurprisingly, this was met with some pretty strong reactions, both from organisations like UEFA and the various football associations and federations impacted by this, and a unanimous rejection by the 14 remaining Premier League clubs of the proposed competition. Fans were understandably various shades of confused all the way to so angry that their piss was coming out as steam, and it even caught the attention of the British government and the major political parties in the UK. What we're going to cover in this video is, what exactly was the European Super League? Has there perhaps been any previous example of a breakaway from an established football structure? What is the role of money and capitalism in all of this? Why was it so bad for fans? And whether there are any solutions being put forward to either stop this from happening again or to actually restructure ownership. Also, if all goes to plan, I'm going to break a little bit of suboptimal news, which is that there isn't really an ideal past state, and the only path that football fans have is to go forward rather than looking back for a perfect moment in the past. What is the European Super League? So, the European Super League was a proposed closed league which had 12 founding members, and they were expecting 3 more members, though that didn't really play out as they expected. The 12 founding clubs were AC Milan, Arsenal, Atletico Madrid, Chelsea, Barcelona, Inter Milan, Juventus, Liverpool, Manchester City, Manchester United, Real Madrid, and Tottenham. Whew. Got through it in one go. Which are some of the biggest brands and global fan bases in football, though there are some sides in that group that perhaps stick out like sore thumbs, like Arsenal, who I think were just happy to be invited, and Tottenham, who... are they really an elite team? I don't know. The idea was that these elite teams who were founding the league would be permanently allocated a spot so that they wouldn't have needed to qualify, so you would have ended up with the 15 founders and 5 additional teams who would have qualified based on their performance in the previous season. The suggested format was that these teams would be split into 2 groups of 10. The top 3 from each group would automatically progress to a quarter-final, while the 4th and 5th place teams in each group would play each other to qualify for that quarter-final, and then it's fairly simple to imagine what would have happened from there. If this sounds suspiciously similar to the structure of the NFL playoffs, that might not have been entirely accidental. So why did this happen? And why did it happen when it did? The idea of a breakaway league isn't really new. There have been hints at proposals since the 90s, most notably the Italian sports management company Media Partners, whose proposal was only put on ice because of UEFA's modifications to the Champions League in 1998. At the time, 12 clubs were prepared to defect, or at least bluffed that they were prepared to defect, to the new Super League, and the cast of teams were eerily familiar: Real Madrid, Manchester United, Inter Milan, and so on. Though if you look at the full list of teams involved, they were a more diverse and arguably more elite collection of teams compared to the ones taking the ESL forward. So these demands for a breakaway usually appear as a response to dissatisfaction with UEFA's competitions, and the pressure produced by them has encouraged reforms to UEFA's competitions, such as those made in 2016, which were made to prevent the creation of another proposed European Super League. The response to this particular breakaway was very severe. UEFA issued a statement saying that the clubs and players involved would be banned from their domestic competitions and that the players would not have been allowed to play for their national football teams. To clarify for those of you who may not know, UEFA are basically the people who run European football, which was why they were so incredibly mad about this. Now, the ESL has collapsed, even if some are still clinging on to the embers of the nightmarish vision, and it collapsed from a combination of a lot of things. Fan backlash, UEFA and various football associations threatening sanctions, leagues threatening sanctions, and a lack of interest in the broadcast rights to the league, making it one of the most hilariously clownish breakaways in recent history. However, this isn't the first time we've seen a breakaway backed by a desire, and I want to be clear that this is what the desire was, to make more money. And it looked like they intended to do this by selling the broadcast rights, which brings us to an example of where one of the seeds for this was planted. The Premier League, sowing the seeds. Breakaways from established structures in order to make more money isn't something new, either in football or in sport in general. And in England we have a very, very good example of it. The Premier League. I'm not going to be able to go into the full context of where the English game was prior to the formation of the Premier League, but I will put up a link to Tifo Football's excellent video where they go into it in some detail. An interesting point was made in a now viral clip where Lawrence McKenna accurately points out that the Premier League emerged out of the Thatcher government and the environment surrounding it. And that's demonstrated by the idea that football had to move up market as to follow the affluent middle class in his or her pursuits and aspirations, as the 1990 Taylor Report wanted to do to the game. The other important thing to remember is, in the conflict between the Premier League and the ESL, there were no good guys. A lot of the critiques being made of the ESL also apply to the Premier League. In fact, the Premier League was born from a frustration with the Football League, who ran English professional football, and its perceived slowness to allow clubs to open up revenue streams, with major competition sponsorship beginning in England in 1982, when the League Cup was sponsored by the Milk Marketing Board.
And you have the milk.
Though there had been attempts in the past, the first that I could find was the short-lived Watney Cup, which ran from 1970 to 1973, which was sponsored by the Brewers Watney Man. Unsurprisingly, the discussion once the breakaway Premier League was in motion turned to, how do we make more money, with TV rights being the obvious place to turn to. Until this point, most football clubs' primary income had come from match day income, be that tickets or other concessions that you could get. This was before the days of clubs merchandising going beyond small team shops. The very first Premier League TV rights deal was valued at £304 million over 5 years, which, when compared to the peak of £5.1 billion in 2015, gives you an idea of just how lucrative the brand of the Premier League, and consequentially the most elite clubs in the Premier League, are, because those are just the rights to show the games in the UK. When profit is the driving motive, can we be entirely surprised that these organisations wanted to push on and make a more lucrative arrangement for themselves? No, but this highlights what the deeper rot is in the game, because the ESL would have been a closed league which would have almost certainly destroyed the viability of the impacted domestic league's broadcasting rights, had the clubs followed through and had UEFA then sanctioned the clubs as they intended to. The money is the motivating factor here. It's why UEFA came out as forcefully as they did, and so did the Premier League, and so did the football associations involved, and it's also why these clubs tried to form a breakaway. The thing is that the Champions League already has the hallmarks of what the ESL would have become. Uncompetitive, stagnant, with little variety in the teams that progress. This is like the Premier League. Take this statistic. Since the inaugural Premier League season 28 seasons ago, there have been 7 unique winners. A fairly decent spread. The mathematically inclined among you will quickly go, well, that's 4 trophies per champion. Sounds pretty decent. But here's the trick. 13 of the 28 were won by Manchester United. The second place club is Manchester City, who have won 5 and have won 2 of the last 4 seasons. I don't think there's a compelling case for the Premier League as some ideal state when compared to the ESL, but it's worth unpacking why exactly this would have been bad for the fans. Why was this bad for the fans? I'm not exactly a stranger to football being a unique form of torture, given that I'm cursed with supporting my hometown team. That being said, the ESL would have been abysmal for the fans. In the last part, I pointed out that the Premier League isn't exactly a paragon when it comes to being a compelling and competitive league. That isn't to say there was ever a time when football was this wonderful egalitarian sport where every team had an equal chance at winning. Of course not. From the very first English top division season until now, 24 teams have won. That's 24 in 118 seasons, which the mathematically inclined among you will notice is not much different from the level of variety that we see in the Premier League. However, the ESL would have been a closed system, not too dissimilar to the franchise model used in the US in their major sports divisions. Think of the MLS, the NFL, MLB, NBA, right? If you follow American sport at all, it's easy to look at that franchise system and say, yes, this is a success on all fronts. What's wrong with the very best teams always playing the other very best teams? A fair question. I mentioned that I supported my hometown team. That team is Reading FC. A special burden that I don't wish upon anyone, given some of the more famous matches they've been involved in. Oh, that's better. That's better. Made it feel a little bit less painful. Anyway, think about the top tiers of American sport. The glitz, the glamour, the Super Bowl halftime show, the funding. And that's the important thing here. While the divisions below the Premier League aren't benefiting from a trickle-down effect, more on that in a bit, look at the divisions that are nominally below the MLS, the American top division in football. Without a promotion-relegation system, those leagues are, and this isn't meant to offend anyone, largely hollow exercises. And that's what would likely befall the teams left behind from the Super League. If you were a fan of the clubs that weren't invited to found the Super League, you had everything to fear from it. What money there is in the Premier League, and for the other leagues in England in the form of TV rights, would, if the plan had been executed properly, likely have gone with the larger names to the ESL. With that movement of money, you likely would have seen the best players from clubs outside the ESL snapped up by the teams within the league, especially as their intention was to remain in their domestic leagues, which would likely have necessitated larger squads. If you're a fan of one of the clubs that was set to join the ESL, and the statistics kind of indicate that you're likely to be if you're a football fan in England, this would have been bad for you as well. It's not unique to those clubs, but the ticket prices for those teams has pushed a lot of fans out of being able to attend matches in person, and you can bet that a move into the ESL with the hypothetically lucrative TV rights wouldn't have led to a reduction in those prices. The other obvious drawbacks for the fans of those clubs that were set to join the ESL is that, well, the FA or your local football association / federation, as well as UEFA, would probably have been forced to follow through on banning the clubs from the competitions. Though we really need to get to the root of this issue. What was the underlying cause that led to all of this, and is there anything that we can do about it? It's capitalism. Before we get into this section, people have a habit of getting really animated when anyone talks about football and how it relates to politics. I just want to remind everyone that fan protests like the ones that we've seen are a political act, and an awful lot of a certain type of person who you can learn about in one of my other videos, they've suddenly come around to ideas that they were pretty hostile to in the past. So bear that all in mind as we go through this. It's not a coincidence that the key figure behind the ESL, Real Madrid president Florentino Perez, is a profiteer from privatization and outsourcing in Spain. but he also negotiated the financing for the league with notoriously sustainable investment bank JP Morgan, borrowing against future TV revenues, which, if I had to point to one of the biggest reasons the ESL failed, it was that they didn't secure those revenues before going public, with the spectacle of pretty much every established broadcaster saying that they weren't interested after the scale of the public backlash became clear. Though I would argue that the ESL itself wasn't aimed at the domestic market so much as it was at other TV markets such as the US and India. A refresher for you all from earlier in the video. The Premier League's first domestic TV rights deal was £304 million over 5 years. This revenue peaked at £5.1 billion in 2015 over 3 years. I would love to put those numbers in a little bit of context, but it's actually rather difficult to make billions relate to something that we can all kind of understand. So trust me when I say that this is a metric shit ton of money, and let's leave it there. So, for as long as your team remains in the Premier League, you're entitled to a share of this money based on where you finish in the league. And if you're relegated, you're also entitled to parachute payments, but that's less relevant for the kind of team that's likely to be going into a European Super League or a system like a European Super League. So long as your team remains in the Premier League, you're entitled to a share of this money based on where you finish in the league, and if you're relegated, you're entitled to parachute payments, but that's less relevant for the kind of team that would be going into a European Super League or a system like that. There are also bonuses if more of your matches are shown live domestically and abroad, as well as a guaranteed minimum return. That means that your typical Premier League football club has a lot of guaranteed revenue, which means that your top performing Premier League football club is going to have a lot of money pouring into it year by year. So that understandably takes a football club from something which most fans would see as something central to community into something much, much worse, which is an investment opportunity. Think back to 2003, to the Glazer family takeover of Manchester United, a takeover bid that included a lot of borrowing against the club's assets, which put the club into debt for the first time since 1931. So, you might imagine that there was a pretty strong fan reaction to it, including the founding of an entire new football club, FC United of Manchester. Here's the thing though, people don't borrow hundreds of millions of pounds for nothing, right? You're expected to service the debt in some way, and the Glazers expected to make profit, to the point that they floated the club on the stock market, allegedly to pay off the club's debts, but of course a significant chunk of that money went directly into their pockets. Never mind that the Glazers are able to move debt freely between their various assets to make their debts look a little less scary. This situation of billionaire owners seeing football clubs as an investment opportunity has become the predominant ownership model at most, if not all, of the Premier League clubs, and a lot of clubs lower down the pyramid of English football. This is in contrast to, say, the membership system in countries like Spain and Turkey, or the 50% plus one fan ownership model in Germany, though we'll be getting into that in a little bit. It's obvious to me, as I hope it is to you, that ownership that seeks solely to make profit isn't going to give a shit about fans and will pursue projects that pitch themselves as lucrative, such as the ESL. When I say the problem is capitalism, I really do mean it. But we're not going to be pressing the communism button anytime soon, much as I might love to do that. So that means that the solutions that have been proposed have been what we might call more market-friendly than I'm ever inclined to be. But it's clear that the ownership model as it stands of a very wealthy holding group that intends to solely extract profit from a brand is a primary cause here, and can't really be allowed to be left alone. That brings me to how we try to prevent it from happening again. The hardest thing to say about this is that I'm skeptical that it was the fan protests and backlash that forced the clubs to backtrack, though those were good, and I think the scale of the backlash informed other more decisive parts of this, such as those broadcasters not being willing to pick up the rights. So, an active and engaged grassroots support is probably going to be a big part of all of this. A proposal from the UK government in response to this was to force a move to the 50% plus one model. Once again, I'm going to link to an excellent TIFO football video on the topic, but as the name implies, it means that a fan group have majority control of a football club, meaning that nothing can be approved without the consent of the fans group. There are definitely ways to get around this model, like RB Leipzig, whose fan club is made up of Red Bull employees who, you know, because of the nature of the relationship between employee and employer, may just vote to do as Red Bull wants. And of course, there's a little bit of leeway with how you determine entry and access to the fan group as it stands in Germany. Another thing that needs to be addressed is the transformation of football clubs into these financial assets. It's hard to reverse that trend. Partial fan ownership alone can't and won't do that. And the fact is that this isn't just bad for the fans of these clubs, but also for the grassroots of football. One of the justifications for the ESL was that the benefits from the increased revenue would trickle down. Now, where have we heard that before? I wonder. We know that trickle-down economics is bullshit, but we definitely know it's bullshit in football. How? Because of the Premier League. The money from things like TV rights, sponsorships, and therefore the ability to have the best coaches, players, facilities, ended up being concentrated at the very top of the game. Is there a solution to all of this? Well, as I said, I want to press the communism button, but you all may not be there yet. And we know that we can't go back to a time of gentlemen amateurs. Plus, let's be honest, a lot of those gentlemen amateurs were taking money in other ways. So, 50% plus one seems like an acceptable start, though there's much more that can and should change. Paying the club staff living wages, allowing the fans that hold that 50% plus one to appoint and sack members of the board based on their performance, mandating that the Premier League give more of its lucrative TV money to grassroots football, ensuring a fairer distribution of those revenues, not just within the Premier League, but throughout the football pyramid. It'd be a good start if we could move towards that. And then, who knows what'll happen next? Maybe Reading won't lose 7-5 after going 4-0 up. I mean, how do you even I just want to thank my partner who read through the script of this and gave her insight as someone who literally doesn't follow football at all, and Mick Wright who gave me good notes on the script as always. You can find Mick's stuff in the description, including his YouTube channel. Otherwise, make sure you like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, Twitch, give me your thoughts on the video down below, and take it easy.